You were ahead of the curve last year in terms of figuring out how to deal with that change in Showdown slates. And I kind of want you to talk about what you did last year, even though people have had a whole offseason to dig into what your strategies were. And maybe, imitation is the most sincere form of flattery. And so people are going to try and do what you did last year. And my viewers want to do what you did last year. But let's start there. What did you do last year to be more successful at Showdown than pretty much everybody else in the field? And then we'll get to things that you might be changing for this season.
Yeah, so I got incredibly lucky is the first thing too. I want to be transparent about that. Mm-hmm. There were a lot of people who did the exact same approach as I did who didn't have the same results. And so there's definitely some of that, but I think I did end up winning 9 out of the 65 Showdown slates I entered, which is pretty crazy. And some of those were chopped and some of those were smaller fields in the playoffs. But the biggest thing I focused on from the offset was just creating correlations in groups that were dictated, not just as far as stacking and generally, but if you're using a certain player at captain, what does that mean for the rest of your roster? And what does that mean for the rest of the lineups? And so that was one of the biggest things I had focused on as an edge. And then, like you mentioned, as the pricing evolved a little bit, I think that became more and more of an optimal, structure as the pricing got sharper. I think the correlation mattered a lot more. So I would say the biggest thing that separated me from the rest of the field was creating groups that correlated based off of who I was using in captain.
So that's for using an optimizer, right? So you're building a lot of lineups. You're trying to build those groups out and do things like that.
Exactly. Everything that I'm talking about here was 150 max entries into the largest GPPs on Draftkings. I actually didn't test any of this in smaller fields. I didn't test any of it in single entry. I basically was 150 lineups or 0 lineups for the most part.
Okay, yeah, and that's kind of how I played it last year. I would just kind of jam the $10 tournament and try and build 150 lineups and get after. But a lot of people don't play that way. Either they don't have the bankroll to play that way, or they don't see the value in playing Showdown like that. So if you were building 20 max lineups using an optimizer or not, or if you were building 1 to 3 lineups for a 3 max or a single entry, what advice would you give to people building those lineups for, not trying to correlate a portfolio over 150 lineups, but building 1, 3, or 20 lineups? How would you advise people to go?
Yeah, so I think the captain is still the most important thing in Showdown, even if you're only entering a single team. So I think dictating what the rest of your roster looks like based on your captain is where you should start, whether it's 1 lineup, 3 lineups, or 20 lineups. I think as you get to 150 lineups, you're still focused on those things, but you're taking more of a diverse approach. So if I was only going to build 3 or 20 lineups, I would probably hone in on just a handful of captains. And a good example would be with that opening slate with the Bears and Packers. Like if you're going to use Davante Adams as the captain, he's going to have the highest scoring night of anybody in the slate. Mm-hmm. And that means Aaron Rodgers is going to have thrown him 1, 2 touchdown passes. So if you're playing Davante Adams as your captain, you have to have Aaron Rodgers in that lineup. And that's the same if you're playing 1 lineup, 3 lineups, 20 or 150.
Right. So you have to think about your captain as how he correlates with the rest of your lineup. Is the first tip that you would give to anybody. It's just like correlation is key, even more so in single game Showdown than it would be in full slate.
Exactly. I think that's a good lesson across all DFS slates is as slate size shrinks, the correlation matters even more. So if you're playing main slate, it matters a lot still, but as you get to a 4 p.m. only slate, Showdown slate, correlation starts to matter a lot more than the projections themselves.
Chat wants to know, can you explain the difference in your choice for captain for cash versus GPP?
Yeah, so I don't play cash games in any sport.
Interesting. You're a GPP only player across all sports.
Yeah, and I used to play NHL cash games a little bit, mm-hmm. but for the most part, GPP only, and definitely for Showdown. Have talked to other people who are successful with Showdown cash games, focus on just trying to jam the highest floor of touchdowns into their lineups. So that's, I guess, advice from some other folks that are successful, but nothing that I've actually used.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, so they're not going for volume. They're trying to embrace all the variants in a single game situation and just try and jam as many projected touchdowns as you can get instead of jamming projected volume in. Because like for this slate, somebody else just brought this up in chat, Trey Burton may not play, and he's priced at 6K. The other tight ends on the Bears, priced way down. You got Sternberger at 16. Or sorry, Sternberger's on Green Bay. You got, what's his name? The tall dude.
Yeah, Adam Shaheen is... Thank you. $400, yeah. And then Ben Braunecker, I guess, would be the backup at $200.
Yeah, so that opens a ton up.
Yeah. So I think the first thing, I guess the second tip would be late news is definitely your friend in Showdown.
Mm-hmm.
Most people are going to be entering these lineups and they're not going to go back and adjust things when inactives are ruled out. So the best case scenario for us would be this opening week that Trey Burton practices limited, is a game time decision, and then is ruled out an hour before lock, because there are going to be 50,000 lineups that aren't going to make an adjustment. They'll probably avoid Burton on the news, but they're not going to go back and play Shaheen in there. So that would be a huge advantage if you're kind of able to build your lineups at the last possible second once that news is confirmed, because Shaheen is already a decent value, even if he plays at all, because of what he lets you afford. So if Burton's out, then he's going to be a slam dunk.
Yeah, there's a ton of set it and forget it lineups in any slate, but definitely set it and forget it lineups in week one of people who kind of log in early in the week. Just put in a lineup like, oh yeah, I'm playing Thursday night or whatever. They just come in and they don't look this far down on the salary list. But I had a good question in chat that says, should you play the guy that you project to have the highest score in your captain spot, or should you play a little bit of a cheaper guy with a lower projection in order to fit one more stud in because of the 1.5x?
Yeah, and that's why I think DraftKings by far has the superior Showdown product, because there are truly scenarios where anybody can end up as the winning captain. So Shaheen is actually a viable captain on the DraftKings Showdown slate, even if you only project him for 5 or 6 DraftKings points, because he would let you afford basically all the other good skill position players that you would want, whether it's Rodgers, Jones, Adams, Trubisky, whoever. And so I do think that Shaheen lineups there are viable with him as a captain, regardless of whether or not Burton starts. In a single entry lineup, I think I would prefer to start with a higher projected player as my captain, and then build groups off of that player. But in an MME portfolio, definitely Shaheen at captain is something that will be in my mix.
Now, you had mentioned something in your article that I was going to reference. I'm not going to reference too much of it because the article is paywalled behind the DailyRoto paywall. But this was a statistic that is kind of out there for people to have, and it's that the amount of wins, or the amount of captains that were at each position, percentage of captains that were at each position on winning lineups, right? It's more wide receivers and running backs that were in winning lineups at captains. I think the total was like high 60% or low 70%.
Yep, about 71%.
Yeah. So like 71% of winning lineups had a running back or a wide receiver in the captain spot.
And I think part of that is driven by a lot of people use the median projections for the game when building their lineups. And a lot of people still are going to use quarterbacks. They definitely have pretty high median projections, but in the situation where the quarterback only throws 1 or 2 touchdowns, chances are really good that whoever they throw those passes to is going to outscore them at the wide receiver position. And so I think that's why you do see some outsized wins at wide receiver, and you see the quarterbacks being utilized at a high rate. That's one of the things you asked about. I was thinking about changing going into this year. It's always hard to make changes after you've had success, but I do think I overutilize quarterbacks at captain a little bit. Seeing some of these metrics here compared to how the field uses quarterbacks, I think in a single entry lineup, even 3 max, I think 3 max would be a good situation where trying to focus on a couple different wide receivers would probably be better than trying to focus on the quarterback captain lineups.
And that makes a lot of sense, right? Because like, if you know that a larger percent of the field is going to be throwing a quarterback in the captain spot, knowing that quarterbacks don't typically win in captain. Now look, it's single game Showdown, so there is going to be a lot of variance, and there is going to be things that, like you want to plug the really high projected guy in there, but like the last season when, like, wasn't it Treadwell that won when he was the captain? That one week he had 2 touchdowns on like 3 targets or something like that.
I think
no,
I was just going to say the other thing is that because the quarterbacks are popular, when they do smash, you still end up splitting that with a lot more people. Whereas if you're able to get the random Treadwell week or whatever, that's when you can actually win as a unique lineup. That's when you can win $100,000 plus, is when you have kind of that uniqueness either at the captain spot or with the guys that you're pairing up the quarterback with.
Yeah. And there aren't that many people. So like, there aren't that many people in the player pool is what I'm saying. So removing specific players from the player pool is going to give you a more truncated list of players. And then if you use DailyRoto to go through and make your groups, right? If you're building 20 lineups, or if you're playing mass multi-entry and building 100 lineups or 150 lineups, whatever you're using that to build, groups is what's going to separate your lineups from all the rest, is trying to make that optimizer dance in a specific way. Can you talk a little bit about, one, very simply, how many groups typically do you end up having on a Showdown slate?
Probably a dozen, I would say.
All right. And where do you start those? Like what type of correlation?
I start with the captains. So I want to make sure I create groups for anybody that I'm possibly going to use as a captain. So that's where the majority of the groups come from, I would say. And then kind of beyond that, I'll make groups to try to restrict situations where I think guys might be competing for playing time. So like one of the examples, I guess, is on this Bears Packers slate that I've been thinking about is how the Bears are going to utilize Taylor Gabriel versus Cordell Patterson, whether or not they're going to compete for playing time at the wide receiver 3 position. And so I think there's a scenario, both those guys have really high ceilings, but low floors in this game. And perhaps they both can't get there on any one lineup, but they could individually get there. And so that might be another example where I'd use a group to try to say, I want my lineups to have at most one of Gabriel or Patterson, but still keep them both in the player pool.
Okay. So like setting a group. So you mentioned captain groups, this is a little different from the other DailyRoto optimizer for the main slates, because obviously captain's not involved on main slates. On Showdown slates they are. So if you've got your captain, you want to build a group for a captain. We said we're not going to build captain groups with quarterbacks because they're not going to win as much and they're overused by the field. If we build a group around, I mean, you can build groups around them.
I would say, just to clarify, I mean, they still win at
you
a
can set exposures
rate.
Though. You can make them lower. Instead of having like 30% of your captain lineups be a quarterback, you can set them to like 5 or 10.
And it's a matter of risk too. Like, are you okay completely blanking the slate if Aaron Rodgers throws 3 touchdowns? Like, I might be okay with that. But if you're playing a higher percentage of your bankroll or something, maybe you don't want it to play as risky. And obviously I was still able to get there last year with Drew Brees as a captain in a unique lineup.
Obviously that's what I was trying to say that about variance before, is that like, you kind of have to accept the variance in daily fantasy overall, and even more so in single game Showdown. So like, while we talk about things that are more or less likely to happen than other things, like we said, a running back or a wide receiver typically ends up winning in the captain spot, that doesn't mean that there weren't weeks where a kicker wasn't the best captain to have, or a quarterback wasn't the best captain to have, because quarterbacks still win at what, 15 or 16% of the time.
Exactly.
Or a defense or a tight end, but most likely it's going to be a running back or wide receiver. So building a wide receiver or running back group, we'll start with Davante Adams. I just want to build one group. So we're going to make Davante Adams the key. So let's start and build a Davante Adams captain group, just to see kind of what we're going to build that group as. Again, you're only starting a few players. So these are groups that are going to be made around Davante Adams as the captain. You can see the little captain's crown there, to add more players to the group. So theoretically speaking, we know that we've got to have Aaron Rodgers in any Davante Adams group.
Yep. So I would use that captain key, and I would set it to be, if Davante Adams is captain, use exactly one of Aaron Rodgers, and more or less would make that group for every wide receiver that we have on the slate. Okay.
So those are all separate groups. So we're going to make one for that, and it's going to be Aaron Rodgers. He's there as the captain. Now, what would be a different group that we could make with Davante Adams? Because any Davante Adams group is going to have him in it. So what other groups should we build around Davante Adams?
Yeah, so I try to limit things, and I would, like, this might be the only group I end up setting. I would say the other group I would consider making for Davante Adams is, if he's going to be the captain, that he's going to take on a high market share as far as the individual receiving yards and the touchdowns. And so maybe you could set up a group that said, if Davante Adams is your captain, you want to use at most one of Marquez Valdes-Scantling, Geronimo Allison, or Jimmy Graham on that same lineup. So if you're using all 3 of those guys, maybe that's not as optimal, because if they're all having huge games, then maybe Aaron Rodgers is your captain. So I guess that would be the other group I would consider. But for the most part, I usually start with the Davante Adams captain with Aaron Rodgers. And then after I kind of create all my groups, I'll look at the 150 lineups and figure out if anything needs to be tweaked.
Awesome. So we're going to build out all those groups. We're not going to do it here for you on the stream or on YouTube, but this is basically how you're going to go about building things, if building mass multi-entry lineups, and how we're going to basically attack these Showdown slates. But Drew, thank you for joining and helping us learn how to be better at Showdown, how to build 1 lineup, 3 lineups, how to correlate those lineups properly, and then obviously how to use this DailyRoto optimizer to help us build mass multi-entry if you're entering 20 lineups, 50, 100, or 150. So thank you for being here, and I appreciate it, man.
Absolutely.